Civilizations rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They decay from within, long before the outside world delivers the final blow. Rome did not simply fall to barbarian invasions. By that time, its people had already lost their sense of virtue, its currency had been debased, and its culture had been consumed by decadence. The collapse was merely the last stage of a much deeper rot. Today, the West, America, Europe, the so called free world, is traveling down that same road. What makes this moment different is that the decline is not a simple historical fate, but the result of deliberate cultural subversion, bad economics, and social engineering. The pillars of Western strength, faith, family, freedom, and responsibility, have been attacked for decades. The result is a civilization that is demoralized, fragmented, and increasingly incapable of sustaining itself. If nothing changes, the West will not merely weaken, it will cease to exist. How it started, the long march through the institutions. In the 1980s, a Soviet defector named Yuri Bezmenov warned Americans about what he called ideological subversion. The Soviets knew they could never defeat the United States militarily, so they focused on hollowing it out from within. Bezmenov described four deliberate stages, the first being demoralization, an attack on a nation's faith, its history, its heritage, and values. Convince the youth that their ancestors were oppressors, their religion, superstition, and their traditions as chains. The second step would be destabilization. Undermine the economy, foreign policy, and defense institutions until people lose total confidence in them. Three, crisis. Exploit chaos, economic collapses, riots, wars, or social upheavals to break society's backbone. And finally, four, normalization. Once the population is exhausted and demoralized, impose a new normal where freedoms are willingly surrendered. Western elites at the time dismissed Bezmenov as paranoid. Yet today, look at college campuses where students chant for the destruction of their own country, or at corporations enforcing speech codes stricter than governments. And his framework today looks less like paranoia and more like a prophecy. But the Soviets weren't the only ones pursuing cultural warfare. Even before Bezmenov spoke, another coercive force was embedding itself in the West, the Frankfurt School. Founded in Germany in the 1920s, the Frankfurt School was a group of Marxist intellectuals. Pardon if I butchered these names, guys, but Theodore Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and Erich Fromm, who concluded that classical Marxism had failed. Workers in Europe and America weren't interested in revolution anymore. They were too busy building families, buying homes, and enjoying prosperity. So these intellectuals pivoted. They turned from economics to culture. If the working class wouldn't revolt, perhaps the culture could be subverted instead. Critical theory was born, an academic discipline dedicated not to explaining or improving society, but to endlessly criticizing and dismantling it. Every institution, Christianity, capitalism, marriage, patriotism, even gender itself, was recast as oppressive. The goal wasn't reform, it was deconstruction. Marquise argued for repressive tolerance, meaning society should tolerate radical left wing ideas but suppress the conservative or traditional ones. That is, cancel culture decades before Twitter even existed. In the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy became infamous for investigating communist infiltration in Hollywood, academia, and government. While his methods were sloppy and often reckless, his underlying claim that Marxist sympathizers were embedded in America's institutions was not entirely wrong. Documents later released under the Vienna Project confirmed that Soviet agents had, in fact, penetrated U.S. government agencies. But the cultural backlash to McCarthyism was severe. Hollywood, the press, and universities railed against him, branding any concern about communist subversion as paranoia or witch hunts. The effect was chilling. For decades afterward, serious discussions of Marxist influence in the culture became a taboo. Ironically, this gave Marxist intellectuals more freedom to advance their ideas in academia and entertainment without any scrutiny. Hollywood shifted dramatically too in the mid 20th century. From the 1930s through the 1950s, films generally upheld societal norms, avoiding open ridicule of religion, direct celebration of crime, or overt attacks on moral order. But by the late 1960s, cultural pressures reshaped the industry. and the Hays Code was abandoned in favor of a rating system. Almost overnight, the tone of Hollywood shifted dramatically. Films began leaning into shock value, explicit sex, graphic violence, and darker, more subversive narratives. By the 1970s, movies like Apocalypse Now and Platoon portrayed American soldiers in Vietnam not as liberators, but as criminals or victims of a corrupt system. To be clear, the issue here is not the soldiers themselves, the real people who served with honor and sacrifice, but how cultural elites use cinema to shift public perception of America as fundamentally rotten. By the 2000s, films such as Fight Club and Joker made alienation, nihilism, and despair into central themes, influencing a lot of the youth. Music followed a similar arc. Jazz, swing in the 1930s, uplifted spirits. Rock in the 1960s glamorized rebellion. Punk in the 1970s attacked tradition outright. And by the 1990s, rap had glorified violence, drugs, and the degradation of women. Each genre was not just a change in style, but a rejection of the values that sustained Western society. I want to make something clear here. I'm not calling for government oversight of art, nor do I oppose free speech. I'm a free speech absolutist. In fact, I believe in unchecked free speech in any circumstance. Artists should be free to create, criticize, and even shock. But we all do have to recognize that freedom of expression can be used as a tool for cultural subversion. Hollywood's turn away from reinforcing shared values towards glamorizing dysfunction, cynicism, and despair didn't happen by accident. We all know who was behind it. It happened because powerful cultural forces wanted to demoralize a generation. This march was not purely grassroots. It was quietly aided by elite foundations. Organizations like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Carnegie Foundation poured millions into universities and activist movements that promoted left-wing social change. Whether from guilt, hubris, or a desire to manage society from above, these elites acted as accelerants. They funded the very critical theories and activist organizations that dismantled the cultural order. None of this was new in history, far from it. Rome debased its currency, abandoned civic virtue, and distracted citizens with bread and circus until the collapse was inevitable. Weimar Germany spiraled into hyperinflation, decadent culture, and moral chaos before falling into tyranny. The Soviet Union itself eventually rotted under central planning, propaganda, and spiritual emptiness. The West is repeating these mistakes, only in a modern way. Instead of bread and circuses, we have Netflix, TikTok, and welfare checks. I know it's corny, but genuinely internalize it. Instead of clubs, we have Pornhub and Hollywood. Instead of commissars, we have university DEI officers and corporate HR departments. Different names, same pattern, same outcome. Free speech was once the defining hallmark of Western liberty, enshrined in America's First Amendment and celebrated as a unique achievement of Western civilization. But today, it's been totally suffocated. In Europe, citizens are regularly arrested for tweets or Facebook posts deemed to be hate speech. In the UK, police infamously investigated a man for retweeting a post about transgenderism. In Germany, new laws enable authorities to fine social media companies millions for failing to remove offensive posts promptly. In the United States, the Twitter files revealed how the FBI, DHS, and other agencies leaned on tech companies to suppress stories, from the Hunter Biden laptop scandal to the COVID dissent. Private companies became the censorship arms of the government. Cancel culture has silenced comedians like Dave Chappelle, who have faced outrage mobs for jokes, and scientists face professional sanctions for political speech. Even children's books have been altered or banned. Ronald Dahl and Dr. Seuss have been rewritten to fit modern sensibilities. Legally, the First Amendment still exists, but practically, speech is managed by algorithms, mobs, and corporate boards. The Founding Fathers imagined censors and red coat. They never imagined them in Silicon Valley. The family, the oldest institution in civilization, has been deliberately dismantled. Extreme feminism in the 1960s and 70s told women that being a mother was slavery, but working for a corporation was somehow liberation. Simone Beauvoir famously declared that no woman should be authorized to stay at home with children, insisting women must work outside to be free. If not, they are considered slaves. Fertility rates across the West have collapsed. The U.S. fertility rate is 1.6 children per woman, far beyond and below replacement. In countries like Italy and Spain, it's closer to 1.3. Divorce exploded after the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s. when California, under Ronald Reagan, became the first state to adopt it. By the 1980s, nearly half of marriages ended in divorce. Fatherless homes now account for nearly 40% of all births in the U.S. Studies consistently show children in these households are far more likely to drop out of school, fall into crime, and end up in poverty. Millennials and Gen Z crushed under massive student debt, $1.7 trillion in the US alone. Astronomical housing crisis increasingly means that these people cannot marry or have children. In the 1970s, the median home cost around 2 times the average annual income. Today, it costs 6 to 8 times. Without families, without children, there is no future for America. In 1950, more than 70% of Americans attended church weekly. Today, fewer than 30% do. Across Europe, the decline is even sharper. In the UK, less than 5% of citizens regularly attend church. Christianity is openly mocked as backwards and oppressive, yet in its place, new secular religions have emerged. Radical environmentalism, which preaches climate apocalypse and offers carbon guilt and ritual recycling as penance. Gender ideology, which treats biological truths as heresy and insists children have the right to choose their own sex. Consumerism, which reduces life's purpose to consumption and entertainment. All of this can be surmised by Nietzsche's famous quote, God is dead and we have killed him. Not only that, but our national identity has been deliberately hollowed out. In American schools, children are not taught that the country is defined by liberty, innovation, or the Declaration of Independence, but by slavery and oppression. The 1619 Project reframed America's founding not in 1776, but in 1619, when the first slaves arrived, casting the nation as irredeemably corrupt from birth. In Europe, nations are told their histories are nothing but colonialism and guilt. French leaders openly argue there is no such thing as a French identity, only a Europe of values. Statues of national heroes are toppled, from Columbus to Churchill. Patriotism is reframed as extremism. Economically, the West has replaced free markets with a system designed to enslave. Endless wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan were made possible only because the Federal Reserve printed money endlessly. Without fiat currency, America could not have waged decades of foreign intervention. Inflation silently robbed savers. A dollar in 1970 has the same purchasing power of $7 today. Entire generations watch their savings evaporate as the cost of living skyrockets. Housing once cost 2 times a family's income. Today, it costs 6 to 8. In cities like San Francisco and New York, home ownership is out of reach for nearly all young people. Wages stagnate while debt soars. U.S. consumer debt has reached over $17 trillion. Student loans shackle young people before they can even build families, and they can never default. Rothbard's warning proved true. Fiat money does not just distort markets, it distorts morality. It trains citizens to expect instant gratification, to live in permanent debt, and to accept dependency as the status quo. Property ownership and family life once gave citizens a stake in society. Without those, democracy is hollow and will soon collapse. Taken together, the results are abundantly clear. Speech is censored, families are broken, religion is mocked, identity is hollowed out, and the economy enslaves. Western society has not collapsed outright, but it has been fatally weakened. And as history shows, with Rome, Weimar Germany, and the Soviet Union, civilizations in this state do not last long. Spain, Italy, and Germany are on the same track. Italy's fertility rate is around 1.2. Germany's is 1.5, and Spain is completely collapsing. The UN projects that by 2100, these countries will lose up to 40% of their population, and America is not immune. The U.S. fertility rate is 1.6, below replacement and falling. Birth rates among native-born Americans are particularly low. Population growth comes almost entirely from immigration here. Europe as a whole is graying. By 2050, 1 in 3 Europeans will be over the age of 65. Health systems and pensions will be crushed under the weight of aging population. Meanwhile, Africa is booming. The UN projects Africa's population will nearly triple by 2100, from 1.4 billion today to 3.9 billion. Nigeria alone is expected to surpass the US population by 2050. Demographics are destiny. A civilization that refuses to have children is a civilization that has chosen suicide. While populations collapse, economic dependency will become total. The World Economic Forum openly advertises its vision for 2030. You will own nothing and you will be happy. This is not satire, it's their policy. In a world of permanent renting, corporations and governments own everything. Ordinary citizens own nothing and thus have no stake in society. Central bank digital currencies are already popping up in pilot programs in dozens of countries. Unlike cash, CBDCs are programmable. Governments could instantly restrict what you buy, where you buy it, or shut off your access entirely if you dissent. In China, digital yuan is already directly tied to the social credit system. The West is not far behind. Universal Basic Income, or UBI, is being tested here in the United States, Canada, and Europe. Sold as compassion, it is actually dependency disguised as generosity. Citizens will be pacified with government stipends, but at the cost of their own freedom. The hand that feeds you will ultimately silence you. Debt slavery. Western households are absolutely drowning in debt. Here in the US, the consumer debt exceeds $17 trillion. Student loans top $1.7 trillion, and government debt is past $34 trillion. Every dollar printed by the Fed makes repayment harder, while inflation silently robs what little savings remain. In a fiat system, debt is the chain, inflation is the whip, and the taxpayer is the beast of burden. Politically, this trajectory ends with the death of democracy. Propertyless, childless citizens no longer think about the long term. They have no stake in the future because they own nothing and will leave nothing behind. Instead, they demand short term comforts. Politicians respond by bribing them with endless welfare, bailouts, and benefits paid for with borrowed money. It's the bread and circuses of today. Democracy rots into oligarchy as power concentrates in the hands of a few technocrats, corporations, and bureaucrats. From oligarchy, tyranny follows. As Alexander Hitler supposedly observed, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can exist only until the voters discover that they can vote themselves wealth from the public treasury. The West has reached that stage. Picture the West if this continues in 2050. Fertility rate of 1.2. Cities depopulated, rural towns abandoned, nations fraying with more retirees than workers, hospitals and pensions collapsing under their weight. Digital serfdom. Every citizen tied to a state-monitored digital wallet. Every purchase tracked. Step out of line politically, and your account is frozen. Universal basic income. A pacified population. Living in government-subsidized apartments, dependent on stipends that buy compliance, but not dignity. The death of Christianity. Cathedrals in Europe turned into museums or nightclubs. Faith erased, replaced by consumerist nihilism and politicized cults. National heroes are forgotten. Statues are toppled, flags are burned, history is rewritten. Schools teaching not pride but shame, patriotism treated as a thought crime. Culture as a distraction, a populace lulled by entertainment, TikTok dances, pornography, and instant gratification, too distracted to resist. This is not the science fiction of tomorrow. It is the logical conclusion of the path that we are already on. Decline is not destiny. Collapse is not inevitable. Civilizations have fallen, but they've also risen again. If the West reverses course, renewal is possible, not just theoretically, but demonstratively. Censorship ends truth. But when speech is free, propaganda cannot compete for long. The marketplace of ideas works only if the marketplace is open. In the last decade, alternative media has surged. Independent journalists on Substack and Rumble reach millions without gatekeeping of CNN or the New York Times. The Joe Rogan Experience routinely outdraws every primetime news broadcast combined. Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter showed that a single change in leadership could crack open previously closed platforms. Historically, free speech movements have rejuvenated nations. The printing press shattered the Catholic monopoly on knowledge in the 1500s, and literature in the Soviet Union kept truth alive under communist repression until the USSR collapsed. If free speech is reclaimed, truth will inevitably outcompete the lies. The family is the original government, the original school, and the original economy. Without it, nothing stands. With it, everything flourishes. Hungary provides a modern example. Under strong leadership, pro-family policies like tax breaks for large families, home loans for newlyweds, life income tax exemptions for mothers with 4 or more children have raised fertility from 1.25 in 2010 to 1.6 today, reversing decades of decline. In the US, even amid collapse, a homeschooling boom is a revival of parent control over education. Since 2020, homeschooling has more than doubled, with Black and Hispanic families leading the surge. Parents are reclaiming the right to pass values directly to their children, outside of the grip of ideological schools. Societies that strengthen families through stable marriages, property ownership, and child rearing incentives create stability across every other institution. When families are strong, crime falls, communities thrive, and nations endure. Fiat currency rots not just the economy, but the culture, teaching instant gratification and dependence. Sound money teaches hard work, planning, and responsibility. The gold standard restrained governments for centuries from inflating away savings. When the US abandoned the gold standard under Nixon in 1971, inflation and debt soared, destroying generational wealth. Returning to sound money, or even parallel currency like Bitcoin or gold backed systems, would free families from inflation theft. Housing would once again become affordable. In 1970, the average home cost 2 years of income. I've never repeated it. And in 2020, it cost 6 to 8. Sound money would stop the cycle of artificial booms and busts created by the Federal Reserve. As Rothbard argued, ending the Fed is not just an economic policy, it's a moral policy. It means ending a system built on legalized theft. A people ashamed of their history will not fight for their future. National pride is not arrogance, it's gratitude for inheritance. In the United States, there's a resurgence of interest in the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and Federalist Papers. States are reintroducing civics educations that highlight liberty instead of grievance. Poland offers a European example. While much of Western Europe wallows in guilt, Poland has embraced patriotism. Its leaders openly defend Christianity, sovereignty, and family, all part of their national identity. It's far from collapsing. Poland is one of the fastest growing economies in the EU. When nations reclaim pride in their traditions, they will recover the will to survive. Nietzsche's prophecy, God is Dead, describes what happens when faith collapses. Nihilism inevitably fills the vacuum. But revival is possible. Even in secular Europe, Christian movements are resurging. In France, Catholic youth organizations are growing again. In Eastern Europe, Orthodoxy is revived after communism collapsed. In the US, survey shows that Gen Z is paradoxically both the least religious and most open to spiritual searching. Conversions are rising, even quietly, as young people reject the emptiness of consumerism and political cults. History proves that revival is possible. The Great Awakenings in the 18th and 19th century America rekindled faith, reshaped culture, and prepared the way for reform movements. Without Christianity, the West is rootless. With it, moral order replaces chaos. This kind of turnaround has happened before. Post-war Japan rebuilt itself from rubble into one of the most advanced societies in the world within a generation by emphasizing family discipline, savings, and national pride. Post-communism Eastern Europe rekindled identity and religion after decades of atheistic repression. Poland and Hungary emerged as nutshells, but defenders of Western values against bureaucrats. Even America itself has gone through cycles of collapse and revival. The Civil War nearly destroyed the Union, but revival moments and Reconstruction rebuilt our country. Civilizations can rise again if they choose to renew over despair. Stopping the decline will not be easy, but it is possible. It requires reversing the exact forces that caused it. Reject propaganda. Support independent creators like myself, Substack writers, and alternative media platforms instead of feeding legacy networks. Strengthen families. Incentivize marriage, children, and home ownership. Reject ideologies that treat family as slavery. End endless wars. Bring resources back home to rebuild nations rather than squander them abroad. In the Fed, return to sound money and free families from inflation theft. Reclaim national identity. Teach history with pride, not shame. Celebrate achievements without apology. Revive faith. Christianity is not just a religion, but a cultural backbone of the West. This is not a one-year campaign. It is a generational struggle. But every revival in history has began with a minority who refused to accept decline as inevitable. Civilizations die when they forget what made them strong. The West was built on faith, family, freedom, responsibility. Today, each of those pillars is under assault. If nothing changes, the West will collapse like Rome, remembered as a civilization that squandered its inheritance. But collapse is not inevitable, it is a choice. The real question is whether we choose to fight. Fight for our speech, our families, our faith, our liberty. Because if we do not, history will remember us as a people who had everything and threw it all away. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate y'all's time. A few of y'all that do watch this, God bless, subscribe. Let me know if y'all have any comments down below, and have a great day. Thanks.